Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go. Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal? To show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Ty Bennett. Ty was just 21 years old when he and his brother started a business in direct sales, which they grew to over $20 million in annual revenue while still in their 20s. As a young entrepreneur, Ty went on to found Leadership Inc., a speaking and training company with a mission to empower individuals and organizations to challenge their status quo, cultivate exceptional relationships, and compete in extraordinary ways. Through his best-selling book, Partnership is the New Leadership, he showcases his innate understanding of business leadership by stressing the importance of creating leaders, not followers. Ty, welcome to Modern Leadership. How are you today?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me. I love the word. I don't even know if it's a word you use, the it's figure-outable. Is that a real word or is that just a word you made up?
You know, I'm trying to teach my kids that it's a real word. And you know, whenever my kids say I can't or I don't want to, I say, guys, it's all figure-outable. They roll their eyes at me. And so now I've added it as part of the podcast.
No, I think it's perfect. I actually came across just recently a definition of confidence is knowing you have the ability to figure it out.
It's not about knowing.
Yeah,
it's about
you don't have
figuring.
to know because you don't know always, but to have confidence in your ability that I can get through this. I can figure it out. We'll figure out along the way. I'm willing to put in the work. So I like that word. I'm going to start to steal it. That's a good word.
We're going to start a movement, the figure-outable movement.
Perfect.
Well, we got a ton to talk about here, but I want to take you back to, what got you fired up as a young, early 20s, wanting to be an entrepreneur? How did you either drive yourself into this or fall into it?
So I've always been a pretty driven person, even as a kid. I was the kind of kid that wanted to make money, was willing to get out there, always wanted to win the sales contest, whether it was selling whatever chocolate bars for the school or whatever it was. So I've always been pretty driven that way. And I actually went to school to study entrepreneurship. That was the path I wanted to take, mostly because I grew up in a pretty nice area and I watched a lot of friends' dads or, adults around me who were entrepreneurs that seemed to have more flexibility in their lifestyle than I saw with other people. My dad was not an entrepreneur. He did very well in sales, but he didn't have as much flexibility in his schedule. And so there was something about it that just appealed to me. And so it was something that I kind of sought out, but not knowing exactly, it's one thing to say I want to be an entrepreneur, but to find a good business idea is another proposition in and of itself, right? And so that actually came by way of my brother, who was also very entrepreneurial and kind of brought an idea to me and said, hey, what if we looked at doing this? And that's how we started our first business.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about that. And I struggle with this as we have these conversations and work with people in how do we find the next big idea? There's plenty of ideas out there, and there's plenty of ideas that are just not going to make it. But how do you stumble upon an idea that's really going to drive change, really going to drive opportunity for you?
Well, I think entrepreneurs are kind of always on the lookout, right? They're always have their antenna up of thinking about and identifying problems and thinking about, okay, that is a problem. A lot of people face that. What could we do about it? I mean, that's where most businesses come from. So I'll give you a simple example that my kids, I have 4 kids. You mentioned kids. How many kids do you have?
I have 3.
Okay. So my kids, I want to teach them to think like entrepreneurs, whether they are or not, just to think about how do I solve problems? How do I to know that things are figure-outable and to apply those skills. So we just developed a simple business idea that honestly, I don't think it's going to make them millions of dollars, but in the area where we live, everyone has water softeners. So you have hard water up here. And so everybody has to get water softener salt from Costco or Walmart or wherever. And it's annoying. I know for me, it's an annoying thing that I always forget, and it's my job. And my wife will always be like, "Hey, you haven't got water softener salt in 3 months because the water is very hard." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I need to go do that." And they're these 50-pound bags, and it's just not a easy experience. So my kids and I said, I brought this idea to them, and I explained, okay, look at this. I said, what if we created a business where you every month delivered water softener salt for people, and you just charged them a little bit more for each bag and an upcharge of like $5 to deliver it. So then we just sat down, we started figuring out the whole business idea. We came up with a name. It's called Salt Taxi. I had a guy that works for me design a logo for them and put together some flyers, and they went out knocking doors, and we posted on Facebook in the area where we live. And last month was their first month. They launched it. They had 15 customers. We delivered like a whole pallet full of water softener salt, and they each made like $50 for the day.
Wow. How old are your kids?
13, 10, and 8.
Okay. So right around my kids' ages.
The 5-year-old did not participate because she could not pick up a bag. So I think just starting to think that way of like, that's a simple need, that it's a pain point, right? It's frustrating. It's annoying for people. I'm sure there's a ton of people, and there was, because all these neighbors are like, that's a great idea. Absolutely. Sign me up. I don't ever have to worry about it again.
Yeah.
Right. Just simple things like that. I think we're always kind of looking out for the pain point and how we could do that. Now, obviously, that's not like the end all be all business. And I think every entrepreneur goes through a lot of ideas. I know I have, of different things that you could do and you kind of bounce them off people, and you try and poke holes in it, and you flush it out before you really invest money or time, huge time into it. And, I don't know. I just think it's part of the process. And on the flip side of that, there's some businesses that I would say that's a stupid idea, and they go on to be huge businesses. So, I don't know that there's a simple formula of how it is. But for me, I think just learning to think that way is an important trait to be relevant in today's world. I think it's part of the modern world that we live in. And so for me, that's why I want my kids to learn to think like that.
Yeah, such a great story. And I believe that entrepreneurship is not just a career choice, but it's also a mindset. And like you mentioned, whether your kids ultimately end up as entrepreneurs in the traditional sense of their career choices, entrepreneurial thinking is relevant and important in any decision, any education or career choices that they take moving into the future. And I think it's great that you're starting them at such a young age and getting them thinking that way. So you started out as a young entrepreneur. You've got your kids starting out as young entrepreneurs. You had quite a bit of success with your first business, but now you've gone on, you founded this Leadership Inc., and you spend a lot of time on the road. I was reading somewhere 37 countries where you've given keynote speeches or done coaching. So tell me about this Leadership Inc. and what you're up to.
So in the process of building our first business with my brother, as we expanded our sales team primarily, I found my role more and more was in speaking and training, kind of the development side, the leadership side of that. And I just fell in love with it. That's what I really love to do. And so I've always wanted to be a speaker. And as I really started to study that industry and reach out to a lot of different speakers and get to know them and pick their brains a little bit, it seemed to me like writing books was kind of hand in hand with it.
Yeah.
And so I wrote my first book in 2010 and started speaking, outside of our business, and it started to grow very quickly. And so I actually sold my half of the first business to my brother. He's still doing that. And now I've written 4 books, and I give about 100 keynote speeches a year all around the world. And I do some coaching, and I host a podcast, and I just spend most of my time in kind of that development space and, having these kind of conversations we're having now.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey. And as I look back over some of your books, here's a little irony for you. So do you recall who wrote the foreword of your 2013 book, The Power of Storytelling?
Yeah, Don Yeager. He's a great friend.
Guess who's going to be on the podcast next week?
Nice.
He follows you.
Don is a stud. Actually, the next book that I wrote, The 2 Most Important Days of Your Life, I wrote with Don Yeager and Chad Hymas, another guy. But yeah, Don will be a great interview. He's a fascinating guy, he actually holds the record. He has more New York Times bestselling books in nonfiction than anyone in the world. And great guy. I had him on my podcast as well, and he's always got great insights. So that'll be fun.
Yeah. And I just thought the kind of the irony of, next
It's a
week,
small world.
literally 2 weeks in a row. And that's the thing with entrepreneurship, with leadership, is it really is a small world. And you've had the opportunity to kind of rub elbows with some great ones. And now you've got this new book. Partnership is the new leadership. So tell us about this. What gave you the idea and why this is important now?
So, my whole thing, being kind of a young leader, I want to make sure that I'm sharing ideas that keep people relevant, that allow them to be effective in today's world. That's why I love the title of this podcast, right? Modern Leadership. My podcast is called Relevant Leadership. I think we're kind of going down the same vein here in terms of what we're after.
Yeah.
And what actually led me to writing the book is I did a survey of 5,000 leaders, and I asked them one simple question. And the question was, what do you want from your people? Right? What do you want? Like the people on your team, people that report to you, what do you want from them? And 76% of the leaders came back and said what they want is commitment. Commitment's kind of an all-encompassing word. They want engagement. They want results. They want people to be committed. But then the next thought process for me was, okay, I agree. That's what I want of the people that work for me. Mm-hmm. But what drives commitment? And people are not committed to jobs. I mean, statistically, if you graduate from college this year in the United States, you'll hold over 30 jobs in your lifetime.
That's incredible.
It's kind of nuts when you think about it. It's almost like one a year. But there's a lot of people that's the case, So, and people aren't committed to companies. So what drives commitment more than anything else is people are committed to people. It's people and relationships that naturally engender trust, that foster accountability, that build that kind of level of commitment. And so I think that the way that leaders show up directly impacts the way that their people show up. And so the old adage would say that leadership was based on title, position, and authority, but I don't think that works in today's world. I think partnership is the new leadership. And this approach of being kind of a partner leader, there's nuances to it. But in essence, you're jumping in the trenches with your people. You're leading, building relationships, giving them a voice. You are part of it with them as opposed to that command and control approach of leadership that probably didn't work that well in the past, but it definitely does not work today.
It's interesting because when you hear the word partnership, at least the way that I heard it, and I come from a legal background, I'm a lawyer by original trade. And so I hear partnership and I'm thinking like an official, equal partners or 1/3 partners or whatever it may be. But what you're talking about is in a leader-follower relationship where you're still the boss, you're still the owner, you're still the leader, but you partner with your team and don't just send them out to do the work, but work with them to make sure that everybody is fulfilling their highest role and purpose within the company.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously there's some partnerships. I've been in partnerships with my brother and in other partnerships. I just mentioned I wrote a book with Don Yeager and Chad Hymas. There's partnerships like that, but in a leader-follower role, can it feel like a partnership? Do your people feel like you're the boss and they're subordinates and you're treated that way? You communicate that way. The relationships are based that way. There's so many things that if we approach leadership more as a partnership, that doesn't mean that you eliminate your job title or your capacity or what it is that you do every day. You don't have to change. Or
the responsibilities of your followers.
Yeah, exactly. None of that has to change. But the mental approach and some of the tactical approach, I think, does need to change.
Yeah, this is such a great topic. And so one of the things I want to dive into then is these obstacles that create failure within leadership. And you talk about the 3 biggest obstacles. Let's talk about them one at a time.
Okay. So, I think there's a lot of obstacles that we face, but more often than not, I think that as leaders, we get in our own way. Typically, if you start to really look at it, that's what breaks it down, where we become, ineffective or less influential. And so one of those obstacles is self-interest. As a leader, I think that when we get caught in the trap of self-interest, when we get caught in the trap of looking at everything from the lens of how does this affect me and how am I going to look if this happens or if this doesn't happen or what's in it for me, we lose the commitment of our people in a huge way. right? People are not going to show up the same way as if you approach it more of how do we all win? How do I make my people look good? How do I give them credit for some of our wins? How do I allow their ideas to stand out? How do I push things forward so that they feel like they're really have a huge contribution and an ownership stake in this process? I think self-interest can be one of those things that really gets in the way of influence.
And I think this is a big shift when we talk about modern leadership and leadership today. This is a big shift from the historical leadership where you referred to title, authority leadership, where boss would sit up in the corner office with the door closed and basically come out just to rant and rage. And the followers felt, hey, you know what? I don't know where I fit in this. I don't want to step on toes. I don't want to go outside my lines because I want to do what the boss says. And now we shift to this current leadership stage where, especially when we look at over 50% of the workforce currently is millennials. And millennials are more interested in the greater, what impact, how can they help or what can they do at a greater stage, not just how can I serve this one in the interest of this one leader. So I think this is an incredible obstacle that leaders face. What's the second one?
The second one is apathy. Leaders, unfortunately, sometimes they just aren't willing to put in the work. Leadership requires more of you. It requires that you show up in greater capacity. It requires that you're constantly growing, you're constantly learning. Now, I would assume that anyone who's listening to this podcast, it does not deal with this because the simple fact that you're here listening to something to better yourself shows that you're the kind of leader that has a growth mindset, that wants to learn, that wants to put good things in their mind. That's an awesome thing. Unfortunately, sometimes as leaders, we get kind of burnt out, we get stagnant, and we don't put in the kind of effort into the job, to the relationships, to the, I'll talk with leaders all the time of saying, I'm just so busy. And I agree, everybody's busy, but those little things of carving out one-on-one time with your people and those things, those can't be the pieces that we push aside. Those are the things that, unfortunately, if we do push aside, we completely kill the opportunity to connect at a deeper level and therefore have better commitment from our people. So I think apathy is a huge one.
Yeah. And I think that as leaders, we go through these times and seasons, and everybody listening to this podcast, they could be at a different time or season within their leadership journey. Some may be just coming back. Some maybe have been leading for a number of years, but apathy is something that we all have to keep an eye on. And you're right, Ty, the listeners of this podcast, those who continue to buy the books and read and study and listen to the podcast and really develop and hone their leadership skills are probably not suffering currently from apathy. But like you said, we go through periods where we could get a little bit burned out. We could get a little bit tired. And at that point, that's when we need to be on our guard. We need to notice what's happening. And at that point, increase the work, know that we need to put it in because we're about to head into a season where it's going to be a bigger struggle for us. We have to force ourselves to do what we need to do as leaders. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, for sure. And there are times and seasons where there's times that you're just tired, right? You've just put in a ton of work and you are burnt out. There are other times that you are just so busy that you feel like you're drowning. And so trying to keep up with all of it is tough. I also think there is a caveat to what we were just talking about in terms of the people who are here listening. I also think that a form of apathy in many cases is there's a lot of people who will be around good, positive things, take it in, listen to something like this, read the books and that kind of thing. But there can be an apathy and application as well.
Yeah.
Right. Because listening to this is a great thing. But if you don't take at least one idea and go apply it and start to put it into the way that you lead, then this didn't do a whole lot for you overall. And so I think the application also has to be in place for it to really have an impact in your life.
Yeah, it's this checklist mentality that sometimes we get stuck in where it's activity over accomplishment, where we read the books or we listen to the podcast so we can put a little check mark saying, we did our leadership for today, but we don't apply it. And so there's no real accomplishment. It doesn't get us anywhere. It just makes us feel like we're accomplishing things. And that's where we get stuck in this kind of routine of doing work, activity, but not really moving the ball forward. Particularly as leaders, we need to watch out for this. What's our next one?
The final one, I think this affects all of us at different times, is ego. And we all have an ego. And, the interesting thing is ego can serve you, but it can also destroy you, because there is an air of confidence that you need to have to put yourself out there, to step up and to lead, to, for me to step out on a stage and give advice to leaders of a Fortune 500 company, or for you to host a podcast and interview these top professionals or whatever. There's an air of confidence that you have to have, but ego gets in the way, where we start to look at things from a very, very myopic approach, and we think we're right. We're not open to feedback. We are stuck in our own ways. We view things as we have all the answers. We don't recognize the talents that others bring to the table. Ego is the enemy. That actually is a great book.
Ego is the enemy.
Ego is the enemy. I want to say Ryan Hamilton,
Holiday.
but that is a
Holiday. Yeah.
Ryan Hamilton is a comedian. Ryan Holiday. There we go. Yeah. So
both great guys.
Yeah, both awesome in their own right. They teach very different messages, but yes. Ryan Holiday is a great writer. That's an awesome book, actually, but I would highly recommend it. But I think ego can be one of those things that, we've seen ego on large scales destroy leaders in huge ways, but in little ways for all of us normal people, I think it gets in the way of relationships. It gets in the way of productivity. It gets in the way of collaboration. It really stifles growth.
Yeah, and nothing stokes the flame of ego better than a little bit of success. And I was on a coaching call with a business owner not too long ago, a couple of days ago, and he has had some great success. The business has just taken off in the last 3 months. And that 3 months has created within him this belief that he's made it. He's arrived. He's done. And from my case, he doesn't need any coaching anymore. But I look at it and I say, 3 months of success does not result in you being a lifetime success, right? It's just a small moment in your entrepreneurial journey. And we need to be careful about this as leaders, that we don't let ego, which is different from confidence. We started this podcast with your definition of confidence, right? This willingness and ability to learn more is confidence. Ego is something different. It stops learning.
Well, let me bring this back kind of full circle to, I love that example you just gave, to this idea we started with. We were talking about thinking like an entrepreneur, right? So you look at most companies, and in the beginning, when you have a startup mentality and things work, you have everybody jumping in, doing whatever it takes to get the job done. When you start to see success, a lot of companies fall into a period where they stop growing because they lose that startup mentality. That is the same process that happens individually. It's what you just described. The reason that guy's been successful for the last 3 months is because he was hungry. He was doing the things that he needed to do. And the funny part about human nature is the minute we find success, we stop doing all those things that created the success in the first place. We stop continuing to be consistent in those things, and we start to think about things differently and therefore act differently. And so, if you have to maintain that humility and that drive to create long-term success. It's hard to do.
And leadership is hard to do, but boy, it's so valuable and an exciting journey to be on. Ty, this is a great conversation, and I wish we could dig deeper into this book, but alas, it's time to switch to our final section of the podcast, our learning from leaders, to add a little personal to go along with this business conversation. Does that sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
All right. Our first question then, is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table? What are you reading?
I am currently reading a book. Literally, I'm looking at my bedside table. It is called The Soulful Leader by Arthur Sierra McCauley. Dr. Arthur C. Sierra McCauley is kind of hard to pronounce and spell, but I had him on my podcast. He's a clinical psychologist that's worked out of Harvard, really interesting guy. And he came out with a new book called The Soulful Leader: Success with Authenticity, Integrity, and Empathy.
Sounds like an amazing book. How are you into it so far?
Yeah, I've gotten into it enough to know that there's some good stuff in there. He shares a lot of stories with, he's like a psychologist for very high-end athletes, CEOs. And so he literally the conversation we're having right now about ego, about these things, this is what he deals with every day and helps people try and reframe and, very successful people. And so, yeah, it's got a lot of great insight.
Very cool. Our next question, what is your leadership superpower?
For me, communication is probably the biggest talent that I bring to the table, being able to communicate ideas well, and with that communication, connect with other people.
Well, and you wrote the book on storytelling. So tell me, why is that an important superpower?
I think I could go through the science of this for days, but stories have a unique ability to engage people, to connect both emotionally and mentally, to move people to action. I think stories are an influencer's best friend. So learning how to tell stories well is one of the most important parts of communication for any leader.
Yeah, one of your other books, The Power of Influence, right?
Yeah.
These all play such key roles in the leadership journey. All right. How about a leadership philosophy quote or mantra, something that you live by?
The one that popped into my mind when you said that is actually by John Maxwell. He said, you can love people without leading them, but you cannot lead people without loving them. And I've just found that to be true. I think that basis of care, and that doesn't mean that you always have to get along, or sometimes you don't even like them, but there's a basis of care that you lead from a place of love, empathy, and concern for other people, that selfless kind of approach to leadership that I think makes all the difference.
Yeah, and I think this is a cool topic, and I'd love to dive into this some more, maybe at a later time. But I'm a big believer that there's this energy in the universe, that we're all connected through energy. When you walk into a room and everybody's in a grouchy mood, you can immediately feel it before you even see or say anything. The same thing when you're leading with love. People can feel that you care about them, that you want this project or opportunity to succeed, and they can feel it without even necessarily hearing or seeing you say it, just by the feeling. And so I love that idea. I love that quote. And of course, anything from John Maxwell is awesome. Our final question is the book that you most often gift or refer to people.
The book, there's several. One of them is Ego is the Enemy, which we kind of brought up before, which is sad that I couldn't think of his last name, Ryan Holiday. But another one that I really love is Love Does by Bob Goff, which Bob Goff has written a couple other books and does a lot of great work. I actually saw he launched a podcast today, literally. But Love Does by Bob Goff is an awesome read.
Well, very nice. And all of these will list on the show notes for this episode. This has been a great conversation about leadership. You bring to the modern leadership audience such a great background and experiences, and a great storyteller as well. Before we let you go, give us one last bit of advice and then tell us, how can we connect with you and pick up some of these books?
One last bit of advice. The other mantra that came to mind when you said, what leadership mantra or what do you try and live by? On the wall in my office, there's a quote that says, when you're interested, you do what's convenient. When you're committed, you do whatever it takes. And that I think has served me well. I think it's a great mantra to live by for anybody. So as far as connecting, we actually set up a page for your listeners at tybennett.com/MLP for Modern Leadership Podcast. And so you can go there and take a look at, through that, connect with me, books are available, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'd love to connect. You can find me at Ty Bennett on social media or wherever as well.
Yeah, excellent. We're going to link all of it up on the show notes. Thank you, Ty, for coming on and being this week's Modern Leadership guest expert.
Thank you for having me.
All right, my friends, what did you think of that? A big thanks to Ty for coming on the show and really talking about leadership, a guy who's lived it, who's been in the trenches, and now spends a lot of his time writing and speaking and training and coaching on how to be a leader and the things to look out for. One of the challenges that I want to give you from this episode is, what can we do to raise our commitment level? You'll recall that very final quote that Ty gave us. How can we become fully committed? not just engaged, not just participants, but committed to do what it takes to accomplish the level of success that we have within us. What can you do this week to raise your leadership game? Of course, everything that we talked about can be found on the show notes for this episode, jakeacarlson.com/ML128, episode 128. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And of course, remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.